The Ardennes region, straddling Belgium and Luxembourg, had seen war before, but in late 1944, with the European theater entering what many believed was its final act, few anticipated it would again become a crucible of conflict. In the aftermath of the Allied breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, the Western Front had transformed. German forces, though bloodied and retreating, were far from broken. Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, sought to reverse the tide through a bold stroke, one that would challenge not only geography and weather, but also the resolve of some of America's most hardened divisions. Strategically, the Wehrmacht's situation in late 1944 was dire. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was hammering toward the Oder, with Berlin's outer defenses beginning to buckle. In the west, Allied forces stretched from the North Sea to Lorraine. But their cohesion was deceptive. Logistics were strained. Supplies lagged behind the advancing front. Fuel shortages, manpower redistribution, and a long, exposed flank through the Ardennes made the Allied position vulnerable. American commanders, particularly those in the First and Third Armies, were under pressure to hold firm until spring offensives could be mounted. For the Germans, opportunity lay in surprise. Hitler's plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, envisioned a massive offensive through the Ardennes to split the Allied line, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. At the core of this effort was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, an elite armored formation that had fought on nearly every front of the war. Its commander, Sepp Dietrich, though lacking in strategic finesse, commanded fierce loyalty and had the trust of the Nazi leadership. Alongside the 1st SS would fight elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 12th SS, forming Kampfgruppe Peiper, named after the ambitious and ruthless Joachim Peiper. Across the lines, the American Third Army, under the dynamic leadership of General George S. Patton, was preparing for a push into the Saar and beyond. Patton's men, particularly the seasoned divisions like the 4th Armored and the 80th Infantry, had endured months of hard campaigning. Many of them were veterans of Sicily, Normandy, and the brutal hedgerows of France. Though temporarily stationed in quieter sectors, they remained combat-ready and agile, thanks to Patton's relentless insistence on mobility, discipline, and aggressive doctrine. Yet, the notion that elite German formations would hurl themselves westward in mid-December seemed unthinkable. Allied intelligence failed to detect the full scope of the German buildup. Bad weather grounded aerial reconnaissance. The region, thought too rugged and forested for major armored operations, was lightly defended by inexperienced or resting American units. In reality, over 400,000 German troops were preparing to strike with 1,500 tanks and assault guns. This scenario created a rare moment in the war, a convergence of elite forces under conditions neither side had fully anticipated. The 1st SS, battle-hardened and ideologically committed, would meet elements of Patton's elite Third Army, men equally determined, better supplied, and infused with their commander's aggressive spirit. The outcome would not only test the mettle of divisions, but also reveal the fractures within Hitler's desperate gamble and the resilience of the Allied war machine. The German High Command knew it was a long shot. Success hinged on 3 assumptions: a rapid breakthrough across the Ardennes, the capture of key bridges across the Meuse, and the paralysis of Allied response due to surprise and poor weather. If these failed, the offensive would collapse under the weight of its own ambition. For many German soldiers, including the fanatical SS units, this was presented not just as a counter-offensive, but a war of vengeance, a chance to erase the humiliation of Normandy and redeem the Reich. Meanwhile, in towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vith, civilians prepared for a bitter winter, unaware that their homes would soon be consumed by the last great German offensive of the Second World War. By mid-December, all the pieces were in motion. In the forests of the Eifel and Schnee-Eifel, tank engines idled under camouflage nets. SS troopers blackened their faces and rehearsed their routes. Artillery was calibrated. Orders were passed in whispers. And to the south, Patton was preparing to shift his attention toward the Saar, unaware that his divisions would soon be marching north, straight into the path of the SS spearhead. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and it would be in this chaos that some of Germany's most feared troops would clash with the iron will of Patton's best. The stage was set for one of the fiercest confrontations of the Western Front, one that would come to define the final winter of the war in Europe. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the Ardennes exploded into violence. At 5:30 a.m., under cover of thick fog and snowfall, a deafening artillery barrage shattered the pre-dawn silence. Over 1,600 German guns and rocket launchers opened fire along an 80-mile front, signaling the launch of Hitler's last major offensive in the West. The initial shock was immense. American positions, held by green or recuperating units, were overwhelmed. In some sectors, communications broke down within minutes. Roads were clogged with retreating convoys. Bunkers and outposts fell silent as German infantry surged forward behind the rolling barrage. The main thrust came through the Losheim Gap, directed at the towns of St. Vith and Bastogne, critical road junctions in the Ardennes. Leading the spearhead was Kampfgruppe Peiper. Composed of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, supporting infantry, and a complement of heavy Tiger and Panther tanks, Peiper's force had orders to bypass resistance, seize bridges over the Meuse, and press toward Liège. Swift movement was essential. Every hour of delay endangered the plan. The Americans, surprised and scattered, responded unevenly. Elements of the 106th Infantry Division, poorly positioned on the Schnee-Eifel, were encircled within 2 days. Entire regiments were captured in mass surrenders, one of the largest in the European theater. Elsewhere, pockets of resistance held stubbornly. In Clairvaux, outnumbered U.S. defenders stalled German armor for a day. At Malmedy, a group of American prisoners surrendered to Peiper's men and were later executed in a massacre that would stain the division's legacy. Patton, meanwhile, had been planning operations in the Saar. Upon learning of the German offensive, he grasped its magnitude faster than most Allied commanders. On December 19th, at a staff meeting in Verdun, Patton informed Eisenhower that he could pivot his entire Third Army north within 3 days. Skepticism was immediate. Roads were icebound. Fuel was scarce. But Patton's logistical corps, among the most disciplined in the U.S. Army, began reorienting thousands of vehicles almost overnight. The 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's most aggressive units, was ordered to move toward Bastogne. As Kampfgruppe Peiper advanced, delays mounted. Fuel shortages, poor roads, and fierce resistance slowed their columns. Bridges destroyed by retreating Americans forced costly detours. By December 20th, Peiper's lead elements had reached the outskirts of Stavelot, but were cut off from supply. In a desperate move, they seized a U.S. fuel depot, briefly prolonging their drive. But without reinforcements and under constant harassment from Allied air power, now returning as skies cleared, the momentum faltered. On December 21st, Patton's advance guard neared Bastogne, which by then was surrounded by German forces. Inside, the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored, held firm despite encirclement. Their defense, though isolated, bought precious time. Patton's officers drove men and machines through snow-covered back roads to reach them. By December 23rd, the vanguard of the 4th Armored was only miles away. Clashes intensified. In the area of Chaumont and Marville, American tankers and infantry met German units head-on in brutal close-range engagements. The 1st SS encountered dug-in defenders supported by anti-tank guns and bazookas. Peiper's attempt to cross the Amblève River failed under heavy fire. Coordination between SS units deteriorated as terrain, resistance, and lack of fuel created bottlenecks. Within days, what had begun as a surprise offensive began to unravel. The Allies regrouped, reinforcements arrived, air superiority returned, but the fiercest fighting was yet to come, as Patton's columns prepared to break through to Bastogne, and the 1st SS, now fragmented and low on fuel, braced for a counterblow. The race for the Ardennes was shifting from German momentum to Allied counterattack, and both sides knew the outcome would shape the course of the war's final months. The German plan, bold in conception, began to reveal its fatal weaknesses as the offensive progressed. Strategic goals that had seemed achievable on paper crumbled under logistical strain, terrain difficulties, and the resilience of American defenders. For Kampfgruppe Peiper and the 1st SS Panzer Division, The mission remained unchanged: punch through the Ardennes, seize the Meuse River crossings, and drive on to Antwerp. Yet, by December 22nd, the gap between ambition and reality had widened significantly. The strategic doctrine underpinning the German plan relied heavily on speed. Unlike the defensive tactics employed elsewhere on the front, Wacht am Rhein was an offensive blitz designed to fracture the Allied line before it could react. To this end, Hitler assigned his most fanatical and best-equipped divisions, including Waffen-SS formations, to spearhead the advance. The 1st SS, hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, was entrusted with a leading role. But even elite formations could not outrun supply lines. Fuel was limited from the outset. With Allied air power grounded, German logistics moved freely in the opening days. But once the weather cleared, air interdiction would become devastating. Patton's command was a model of adaptability. As the German plan unraveled, the American Third Army reoriented itself with astonishing speed. Patton's staff, led by General Hobart Gay and logistics expert Major General John C. H. Lee, orchestrated the massive movement of men and materiel northward. Trains, convoys, and road-bound armor pushed forward through icy terrain, congested paths, and ambush-prone villages. Units like the 4th Armored Division and the 26th Infantry Division were dispatched in force, each tasked with converging on Bastogne from multiple directions. German forces, meanwhile, struggled with coordination. The 1st SS advanced ahead of the main body, often without sufficient infantry or logistical support. Piper's troops found themselves in contested villages, forced to clear houses room by room against determined American defenders. In towns like Stavelot and L'Église, the terrain favored defense. Bridges were rigged with explosives. Civilians evacuated or took shelter in cellars. The terrain, once considered passable, now proved treacherous. Narrow roads, thick forests, and deep snow made coordinated assaults increasingly difficult. Despite these setbacks, Piper's Kampfgruppe continued to press forward, driven by a sense of mission and ideological fervor. Their advance, however, took on a more chaotic tone. Units became scattered, fuel trucks were lost or destroyed, communications with higher command faltered, the dream of a lightning breakthrough faded. As Allied resistance stiffened and reinforcements arrived, the German timetable collapsed. The Meuse was no longer a reachable target. It became a mirage. Within Patton's ranks, morale surged. The swift counter-movement had caught many by surprise, even among Allied commanders. The 80th Infantry Division moved to protect southern flanks, while armored units pushed toward Bastogne. The weather, though still harsh, began to shift. By December 24th, Allied aircraft took to the skies again. Thunderbolts and Mustangs began striking German convoys, isolating Piper's forward elements and worsening their already precarious fuel situation. Strategic miscalculations on the German side compounded the failures. Hitler's insistence on capturing Antwerp had diverted attention from more limited, achievable objectives. The offensive had been gambled on achieving total surprise and speed. Now, facing dug-in Americans and rapidly converging Allied reinforcements, the SS spearhead found itself isolated, harassed from the air, and squeezed from multiple directions. What had begun as a mechanized thrust now became a bitter, grinding retreat. Meanwhile, Patton's divisions prepared to strike hard. Recon units reported roadblocks and ambush sites. Engineers cleared paths under fire. The push toward Bastogne intensified, with terrain, enemy resistance, and winter conditions all complicating the assault. But Patton remained resolute. His doctrine of aggressive engagement, never letting the enemy rest, always pressing forward, would soon be tested against the hardened veterans of the 1st SS. The stage was shifting once more. The German plan was breaking down, but the fight was far from over. In the hills and forests of the Ardennes, as snow turned red and smoke marked the skies, the inevitable clash between the elite of the Waffen-SS and the spearhead of Patton's Third Army grew imminent. Both forces were converging on Bastogne, a strategic linchpin that neither side could afford to lose. By December 24th, the German offensive had reached a critical juncture. The initial shock had worn off, and American units were now firmly engaged across multiple sectors. In the heart of the Ardennes, Bastogne remains surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division, alongside elements of the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions, held the town under siege, enduring constant artillery barrages, dwindling supplies, and bone-chilling temperatures. Despite the encirclement, morale held. American commanders inside Bastogne, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, refused to surrender. His famous one-word reply, "Nuts," delivered to German envoys demanding capitulation, became a symbol of defiance across the Allied front. While the 101st dug in, the Third Army continued its push northward. Patton's 4th Armored Division, moving under extreme weather conditions, approached Bastogne from the south. Their route passed through treacherous ground, ice-covered roads, dense forest paths, and towns booby-trapped by German rear guards. Units like the 37th Tank Battalion and the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion spearheaded the movement, clashing with German patrols and probing enemy lines for weaknesses. To the north and east, Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance had stalled. The 1st SS Panzer Division, fragmented and exhausted, found itself isolated in and around L'Église. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. American forces had blown key bridges, blocking retreat routes. Surrounded and outnumbered, Peiper's men began abandoning vehicles, including prize Tiger tanks, in a desperate attempt to escape on foot. Their breakout through snowy woods marked the effective end of their operational relevance in the Ardennes campaign. Still, German resistance elsewhere remained fierce. Along the southern flank of the Bulge, the 5th Panzer Army attempted to hold ground as Patton's divisions closed in. Skirmishes erupted in villages like Bigonville and Chaumont. At every turn, American units encountered minefields, entrenched positions, and counterattacks by battle-hardened Wehrmacht and SS troops. Despite the enemy's tenacity, the Third Army maintained momentum, slowly compressing the German salient. On December 26th, the breakthrough came. Lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion reached the outskirts of Bastogne, punching through German defenses at Assenois and linking up with the defenders. Though the corridor remained narrow and under fire for days, the siege was effectively broken. Supplies, medics, and reinforcements poured in. For the Germans, this marked a significant failure. Bastogne, a vital junction, had not fallen. The battle was not yet over. The Wehrmacht launched continued assaults around the perimeter in an attempt to retake Bastogne, but American artillery and air support, now fully active with clear skies, turned the tide. Every German movement during daylight was met with strafing runs and bombing raids. The Luftwaffe attempted to intervene with desperate sorties, including Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, but the damage inflicted was far outweighed by losses sustained. The confrontation between Patton's veterans and the Waffen-SS had unfolded across numerous points, sometimes indirectly, sometimes in violent clashes along roads, hills, and forest edges. The superiority of American logistics, firepower, and mobility had gradually outmatched the initial fury of the German offensive. The 1st SS Panzer Division, once envisioned as the spearhead of Hitler's breakthrough, was now a shattered force, its reputation bruised, its momentum extinguished. As 1944 came to a close, the Germans found themselves on the defensive once more. The Bulge, once a massive protrusion into Allied lines, began to collapse. Units were pulled back. Some formations, such as Peiper's, ceased to exist as organized entities. The initiative had returned decisively to the Allies. The clash between the 1st SS and Patton's advancing forces had not played out as a singular set-piece engagement, but rather as a series of fluid, grueling confrontations, armor against armor, infantry against dug-in defenders, both sides fighting under brutal conditions. It was a testament to both the desperation of the Nazi regime and the resilience of the Allied campaign. The Ardennes had become a graveyard for German hopes of a negotiated peace. As the Battle of the Bulge entered its second week, the crisis deepened on both sides. The initial shock of the German offensive had been absorbed, but the scale and tenacity of the fighting reached unprecedented levels for the Western Front. The frozen terrain, narrow roads, and forested hills turned every engagement into a deadly test of endurance. For the Americans, the central priority became closing the Bulge and cutting off any chance of renewed German momentum. For the Germans, maintaining the salient, even in the face of mounting losses, was crucial to buying time and forestalling an Allied advance into the Rhineland. The fiercest clashes now concentrated along the eastern and southern flanks of the German thrust. Patton's Third Army intensified its operations, seeking to both relieve Bastogne and drive a wedge between German armored units still attempting to consolidate their gains. The 4th Armored Division, having broken through to Bastogne, now faced counterattacks from remnants of the 2nd Panzer and Panzerlehr divisions. These German formations, though depleted, retained enough firepower to threaten isolated American columns. The SS divisions, including what remained of the 1st SS Panzer, were now fighting in fragmented groups. The failures of Kampfgruppe Peiper had drained critical resources, and many of the division's tanks and armored vehicles had been abandoned or destroyed. German infantry units dug in along key crossroads and hilltops, using the terrain to their advantage. Still, the relentless pressure from Patton's mobile formations, particularly the 6th Armored Division moving in from the west, began to stretch the German lines thin. American commanders adapted their strategy to the conditions. Rather than broad frontal assaults, Patton employed rapid flanking maneuvers, supported by coordinated air and artillery strikes. The arrival of clear weather proved decisive. Allied air superiority, long suppressed by snow and fog, returned in full force. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force targeted German convoys, artillery positions, and fuel depots. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest the skies, but suffered heavy losses in desperate raids. Meanwhile, along the northern edge of the Bulge, American First Army units, reinforced by British elements under Montgomery's command, launched renewed attacks. Their objective was to meet Patton's forces advancing from the south, effectively trapping the remaining German formations. The tightening vise threatened to encircle large portions of the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies. The speed and coordination of the Allied response astonished many observers, including the Germans themselves, who had believed the Ardennes terrain would render such maneuvers impossible. The psychological toll of the fighting was immense. German troops, often under-equipped and lacking winter clothing, began surrendering in increasing numbers. Morale collapsed in units cut off from supply or command. For the Americans, the conditions were no less brutal. Frostbite, exhaustion, and constant artillery fire took their toll. But the sense of momentum now lay clearly with the Allies. Still, fighting remained bitter in key locations. In villages like Lutrebois, Assenois, and Wardin, the 1st SS and other elite German units fought with fanatical determination, often refusing to withdraw even when encircled. Patton's troops encountered snipers, mines, and hidden anti-tank guns at every turn. The landscape bore the scars of total war, charred vehicles, frozen bodies, and shattered buildings lining the roadways. One particularly intense engagement unfolded near the town of Cibray, southwest of Bastogne, where American armored and infantry units faced a counteroffensive launched by surviving SS battle groups. The terrain, open fields intersected by forested ridges, offered little cover. The engagement lasted 2 days, with heavy losses on both sides. Ultimately, the Americans held the ground, forcing yet another retreat. By early January 1945, the front lines began to stabilize. German offensive capacity was nearly exhausted. The Allies had regained lost territory in multiple sectors and were preparing a coordinated push to fully collapse the Bulge. For the 1st SS, this campaign marked a turning point. No longer an unstoppable vanguard, it had been reduced to scattered remnants retreating under fire. The broader crisis within the German command structure also deepened. Hitler's insistence on continuing the operation, even as its failure became evident, led to internal disagreements. Field commanders like Rundstedt and Model began to question the strategic value of continuing the fight in the Ardennes, but their concerns were overruled. The obsession with holding territory, even as men and machines were consumed, became emblematic of the final phase of the war in the West. The crisis in the Ardennes had evolved from a surprise offensive into a grinding war of attrition. Patton's elite forces, through relentless coordination, improvisation, and combat discipline, had turned the tide. The Waffen-SS, though still formidable in name, had lost its spearhead and its aura of invincibility. The Bulge was beginning to contract, and the balance of power on the Western Front had irreversibly shifted. As January 1945 began, the Battle of the Bulge reached its brutal apex. The German salient, once a bold thrust into the Allied front, now resembled a bleeding wound, stretched thin and under fire from all sides. It was during these final, desperate days that the most intense fighting unfolded. The Wehrmacht threw in its last reserves to hold key positions, while the Allies unleashed a coordinated hammer blow to crush the Bulge and force a German withdrawal. Patton's Third Army, having broken through to Bastogne, expanded its offensive in all directions. The 11th Armored Division was committed to the fight, supporting the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions in encircling enemy strongpoints and severing retreat routes. American artillery, well-stocked and expertly coordinated, hammered suspected German positions day and night. Each town and ridge became a fortified bastion, defended with machine guns, mortars, and booby traps. German resistance, though disjointed, remained vicious, particularly from SS units unwilling to yield. The 1st SS Panzer Division, or what remained of it, fought delaying actions in a rapidly collapsing environment. Lacking fuel, many of its armored vehicles had been abandoned or destroyed. Infantrymen dug into villages and forest lines, hoping to stall the Allied advance long enough to allow other German formations to retreat eastward. In some sectors, the division fought alongside Volksgrenadier units and retreating elements of the Panzerlehr Division. These mixed formations lacked cohesion but not determination. At the same time, the Allies intensified pressure along the northern arc of the Bulge. British forces under Montgomery launched attacks from the north, converging with Patton's southern drive. The pincer movement began to compress German forces trapped in the salient. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, engaged in heavy fighting around Manhay and Grand Mesnil, attempted to hold its ground, but was gradually pushed back. Morale crumbled in rear-echelon German units, while frontline soldiers faced an increasingly hopeless situation. Bastogne remained a symbol of American resistance. Though no longer encircled, it remained under intermittent fire. Patton ordered continued operations to secure the area and expand the corridor. The 101st Airborne, still holding defensive positions in the forests surrounding the town, clashed repeatedly with German patrols. Winter conditions added to the misery. Snowfall, freezing rain, and limited visibility hampered all movements. Trucks and tanks froze overnight. Medics struggled to evacuate the wounded, and supply lines were frequently targeted by German artillery and sabotage teams. In the southeast, towns like Villers-le-Bon-Haut, Michon, and L'Outremange became battlegrounds. The fighting was close and brutal, infantry clearing houses, tanks firing at point-blank range, and artillery reducing entire streets to rubble. Patton's orders were clear: push forward at every opportunity, exploit every German weakness, and avoid giving the enemy any room to regroup. American engineers worked tirelessly to rebuild bridges and clear roads, ensuring the advance could continue without delay. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe made a final effort to alter the course of the campaign. On January 1st, Operation Bodenplatte was launched, a massive surprise air assault on Allied airfields across the Low Countries. While it achieved temporary disruption, the cost was catastrophic. German losses in pilots and aircraft were irreplaceable. The skies over the Ardennes returned quickly to Allied control, and close air support resumed, devastating German columns trying to escape. The humanitarian toll became increasingly evident. Villages caught in the path of the fighting were obliterated. Civilians who had not fled lived in cellars, surviving on dwindling supplies. Thousands were displaced, their homes reduced to scorched ruins. American medical units, overburdened by the wounded, established field hospitals in barns and abandoned schools. The Red Cross distributed what little aid could reach the front, but the scale of destruction made relief efforts difficult. High command on both sides now recognized the inevitable. German commanders like von Manteuffel and Model petitioned for strategic withdrawals to salvage their forces. Hitler, however, remained fixated on holding ground, issuing orders to counterattack even when the troops and equipment were no longer available. This disconnect between frontline reality and Führer-level delusion only deepened the chaos and loss. Patton, by contrast, maintained operational flexibility. He adjusted his axis of advance based on terrain, enemy movement, and real-time intelligence. His aggressive leadership, combined with the discipline of his corps commanders and the tenacity of his troops, had reversed what could have been a catastrophic breach. The spearhead units of the Third Army continued advancing, reclaiming village after village, pressing the Germans ever backward. The peak of the Ardennes campaign revealed not only the limits of German strength, but the full capacity of American and Allied warfare. It was a clash of ideologies, technologies, and military cultures at their most extreme. The 1st SS Panzer Division, though fearsome, had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and ultimately overwhelmed by a force that combined mobility, firepower, and superior logistics. The tide of battle had turned decisively, and with it, the momentum of the war in the West. By mid-January 1945, the German High Command could no longer deny the truth. Wacht am Rhein had failed. What was envisioned as a war-winning offensive had devolved into a costly retreat through the same snow-covered forests and villages it had once stormed through. The Bulge, now rapidly deflating under unrelenting Allied pressure, became a killing field for exhausted, undersupplied German units. The remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Division, having lost the bulk of its armor and much of its cohesion, were among the many formations forced into a fighting withdrawal. Patton's forces, having secured Bastogne and pushed deep into the southern edge of the Bulge, now pressed the advantage. The 6th Armored Division advanced toward Wiltz, while the 11th and 4th Armored Divisions expanded their zone of control eastward. Infantry units cleared hills and valleys that were still fiercely defended by pockets of SS and Wehrmacht troops. Minefields, snipers, and rearguard actions slowed progress, but could not stop it. American artillery, fully operational and lavishly supplied, pounded German fallback positions with mechanical efficiency. To the north, the U.S. First Army under General Hodges and the British XXX Corps under Montgomery converged on the shrinking German salient. The coordination between Allied forces, after early confusion and logistical friction, had improved significantly. Air-ground cooperation resumed at full capacity. Fighter bombers patrolled roads and rail lines, targeting every column, every fuel truck, every sign of retreat. The Wehrmacht's motorized units were chewed apart in column as they tried to escape the jaws of encirclement. Within the 1st SS Panzer Division, command authority broke down. Joachim Pieper, having abandoned his armored column weeks earlier, had rejoined German lines on foot. The surviving troops of Kampfgruppe Pieper were folded into improvised battle groups, many of which were repurposed as rearguard infantry. Once a symbol of Nazi battlefield prowess, the 1st SS now fought not for victory, but for survival. Fuel reserves were gone, ammunition was rationed, communication was intermittent or non-existent. Orders were often contradictory or based on outdated assumptions. The idea of seizing Antwerp had long since vanished. As American units advanced, they encountered scenes of devastation, blackened husks of tanks, wrecked convoys buried under snowdrifts, and fields strewn with frozen corpses. Some villages had changed hands multiple times, leaving them barely recognizable. Civilians returned to ruins, scavenging what little remained. The psychological toll was heavy. Many German prisoners taken in this phase were wounded, frostbitten, or shell-shocked. Some were teenagers drafted into Volksgrenadier units. Others were veterans from Russia, hollow-eyed and silent. In the final engagements around Houffalize, American and British forces executed the maneuver that finally sealed the Bulge. The town, located near the center of the German salient, became the pivot point of the Allied pincers. On January 16th, units from Patton's Third Army met up with the U.S. First Army, completing the encirclement of the remaining German forces in the area. Though some units managed to escape through gaps under cover of darkness, thousands were captured and hundreds of vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. German counterattacks continued sporadically through late January, but lacked coordination and material strength. Hitler, still obsessed with offensive action, ordered Operation Nordwind in Alsace to divert Allied attention, but it achieved little and further depleted already exhausted reserves. The final retreat from the Ardennes was neither orderly nor strategic. It was reactive, chaotic, and marked by desperate attempts to salvage men and equipment. On the Allied side, The mood was one of grim vindication. Casualties had been high, over 8,000 for the Americans alone, but the victory was decisive. The ability to rapidly respond to the offensive, realign entire armies, and sustain logistical operations under extreme conditions demonstrated the maturity of the Allied war effort. The performance of Patton's Third Army stood out in particular, earning praise even from skeptical British commanders. His gamble, turning an entire army 90 degrees in a matter of days and charging into an unfolding crisis, had paid off. For the German military, the Battle of the Bulge marked the last major offensive of the war in the West. The 1st SS Panzer Division, once Hitler's prized unit, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Its reputation, already stained by atrocities at Malmedy, now carried the additional weight of failure. The myth of invincible SS armor had been shattered in the snow and forests of the Ardennes. The terrain that had so briefly served the Germans as a springboard for ambition now became a trap from which they could not fully escape. The Bulge was gone, but the cost of its creation would echo through the remainder of the war, draining the last strength from a regime already spiraling into collapse. Patton's elite had met the Waffen-SS at their strongest and broken them. With the German offensive collapsing and the Wehrmacht retreating from the Ardennes, the character of the campaign shifted from direct confrontation to attritional pursuit. The remnants of German armored divisions, including fragments of the 1st SS Panzer Division, attempted to regroup behind hastily established defensive lines along the Our and Sauer rivers. These defensive belts, formed largely from rear area personnel, retreating battle groups, and overused artillery units, were makeshift and fragile. The Allies, seeing the window of German disarray, sought to exploit it before the front could stabilize. Patton's Third Army continued pressing forward, adapting to changing battlefield conditions with characteristic aggressiveness. Winter weather, while still punishing, no longer impeded movement as severely. Road networks were cleared, bridges were rebuilt, and supply chains flowed once more. American forces, better equipped and supported than at any previous point in the campaign, used their mobility to outmaneuver retreating enemy formations. Infantry units mounted on half-tracks, supported by tank destroyers and close air support, swept through villages left in disarray by the German withdrawal. The German strategy during this phase was simple: delay, inflict maximum casualties, and buy time. The 1st SS Panzer, now functioning as an infantry-heavy rearguard, participated in a series of holding actions designed to slow the Allied advance along key routes into the Eifel region. In towns like Neuerberg and Vianden, scattered elements of the division dug into hillsides, laid ambushes in forests, and fought desperate delaying battles. Their effort was not to win, but to bleed the attackers and preserve what was left of Hitler's elite formations for future, though increasingly unlikely, defense. Despite their deteriorating condition, these German units remained dangerous. In several instances, American reconnaissance units were ambushed by SS machine gun nests, concealed in barns or wooded groves. Mines and roadblocks became daily hazards. German artillery, though diminished, still delivered deadly barrages with remarkable precision when conditions allowed. In some areas, local counterattacks by scratch formations, including Panzer Grenadier elements and retreating Volkssturm, temporarily disrupted American advances. But these efforts, unsupported by armor or air power, quickly faded. Patton's doctrine of continuous pressure paid off. He insisted that no opportunity be wasted, that every German weakness be immediately exploited. His commanders pushed ahead despite fatigue, rotating units where possible, and maintaining the momentum necessary to prevent a German consolidation. This relentless pressure shattered unit cohesion among retreating Germans, many of whom surrendered en masse or abandoned equipment rather than risk encirclement. Allied innovation and adaptation also played a critical role. Engineers constructed temporary bridges across rivers under fire, while intelligence officers intercepted German signals and tracked retreat patterns. The reintroduction of continuous aerial surveillance helped guide ground units toward enemy strongpoints. By mid-January, American columns reached the outskirts of Prüm and Vianden, deeper into German territory than at any point since the counteroffensive began. Behind the front, efforts to rebuild shattered American units accelerated. Casualty replacement systems replenished lost manpower, while repair crews restored damaged vehicles. Morale, despite the brutal conditions, remained high, bolstered by the knowledge that the tide had decisively turned. In contrast, German soldiers, lacking supplies, fuel, and coherent leadership, began to desert in larger numbers. Reports of low morale, insubordination, and even mutiny surfaced within rear-echelon Wehrmacht units, though SS elements maintained stricter control through threat and ideology. Resistance movements in Belgium and Luxembourg, emboldened by the retreating enemy, increased their activity. Partisan units guided Allied columns, sabotaged German communications, and assisted in clearing isolated pockets of resistance. The collapse of the German offensive created opportunities for these civilian networks to exact revenge and reclaim territory after months of repression. The psychological contrast between the two armies could not have been starker. Patton's divisions, exhausted yet victorious, marched forward with confidence, backed by overwhelming firepower and strategic clarity. The Waffen-SS, once feared for their discipline and ferocity, now moved in confusion, defensive, improvised, and desperate. The meeting of Patton's best with the SS elite had proven not only a military clash, but a battle of endurance, logistics, and adaptability. As the Bulge faded and the front line pushed eastward, Allied planners turned their attention to the Siegfried Line and the Rhineland beyond. The Ardennes had been a proving ground, harsh, costly, and decisive. For the 1st SS, the campaign left scars that would never heal. For Patton and his men, it was a victory etched in fire and snow, a testament to speed, resilience, and tactical mastery. But the war was not over, and the road into Germany now lay open. The turning point of the Battle of the Bulge had already passed by the 3rd week of January 1945, but it was in the final push across the Ardennes and into the German frontier that the last decisive shifts occurred. These days saw the collapse of all remaining German offensive capabilities in the West. Exhausted, encircled, and unable to resist the momentum of Allied forces, the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS found themselves either fleeing, surrendering, or dying in place. For the 1st SS Panzer Division, the fight was no longer for victory or breakthrough. It was for preservation and survival under the crushing weight of superior Allied coordination. One of the most pivotal moments came during the race toward the town of St. Vith, a logistical linchpin which had changed hands earlier in the campaign. The Germans, recognizing its critical road network and the chance to form a defensive hinge, had reoccupied it after initial success. But by mid-January, Patton's Third Army, reinforced by fresh elements of the 87th and 90th Infantry Divisions, mounted a multi-pronged assault to retake it. The town, devastated by earlier fighting, had become a frozen shell of its former self. German defenders, including remnants of SS units and hastily reconstituted grenadier battalions, clung to the ruins. The fighting was close and relentless. Machine gun nests in basements, artillery zeroed in on likely crossing points, and counterattacks launched with borrowed vehicles. It was here that the final illusion of German counteroffensive capability broke down. American forces executed enveloping maneuvers, bypassing strong points and cutting roads behind them. Armor from Patton's spearhead formations began to encircle St. Vith. Luftwaffe support was negligible, communications faltered. On January 23rd, the town was finally retaken, and with it, one of the last major pillars supporting the German presence in the Bulge. For the 1st SS Panzer, now spread across various defensive positions, the inability to hold any fixed point led to full withdrawal orders. What had started as an elite mechanized formation was now scattered into small infantry units, often retreating on foot, moving through woods and side roads to avoid Allied patrols. Many left behind equipment, vehicles, and even wounded comrades. Those captured spoke of chaotic chains of command, missing officers, and the complete breakdown of resupply channels. For the Allies, especially the Americans who had faced them in the South, it was confirmation that the feared SS spearhead had been irreparably shattered. In the area around Diekirch and Clairvaux, another key engagement played out that demonstrated the total reversal in battlefield initiative. While initially lost in the early days of the offensive, these areas were now scenes of American counter-pushes supported by close air support and engineering teams. Bridges across rivers were thrown up in hours. German artillery positions were located and destroyed by air observers. Tanks rolled down streets that had once been marked by smoking wrecks of Sherman and Panther alike. For local civilians, the return of American troops meant both liberation and exposure to the terrible aftermath of battle. Fields frozen with bodies, churches destroyed, and forests marked by unburied dead. The operational breakthrough came not in a single moment, but in a cumulative chain of local victories, quick adaptations, and ruthless exploitation of German errors. Patton's commanders anticipated every attempt by German units to regroup, intercepting supply convoys, targeting fuel depots, and sealing off forested routes that had become escape corridors. What remained of the 1st SS had no choice but to attempt withdrawal east of the Our River. Allied engineers, however, had mined roads and rigged bridges for demolition. Some German troops drowned attempting to cross icy rivers. Others were shelled in convoys. By the end of January, the once proud division was no longer a coherent fighting force. This turning point was not simply military. It had political and symbolic weight. The failure of the Ardennes offensive ended Hitler's last gamble to divide the Allies and stall their advance toward the Rhine. For the Nazi regime, the collapse of the 1st SS Panzer and its sister divisions destroyed any remaining hope of regaining strategic initiative. For the Allies, it confirmed the effectiveness of their combined arms doctrine, the maturity of their command structure, and the battle hardening of units like Patton's Third Army. The enemy had launched its best and been met with force, fire, and unshakable resolve. As Allied planners turned their attention to breaching the Siegfried Line, there was no more talk of enemy offensives. The 1st SS had come, struck with fury, and been repelled. The Ardennes, once feared as a German stronghold, now lay behind the lines, its forests quiet, its roads reopened, and its villages under Allied control. The war was moving into its final phase, and the Wehrmacht would never again mount an offensive on the Western Front. As February 1945 opened, combat operations in the Ardennes tapered into a grim but methodical cleanup. The last German rearguards melted away under artillery, harassing fire, and relentless air patrols that swept every forest road and river crossing east of the Our. American patrols advanced cautiously, expecting mines or booby-trapped strongpoints, but more often they found abandoned field kitchens, overturned wagons, and shivering prisoners who had simply run out of food and ammunition. The Battle of the Bulge was over. What remained was the costly task of securing the ground, counting the losses, and preparing for the drive to the Rhine. Across the former salient, improvised prisoner cages sprouted in meadows and orchards. Here, hastily constructed barbed wire enclosures held a cross-section of the defeated, wounded veterans from the Eastern Front, teenage Volksgrenadiers, and scattered contingents of Waffen-SS, whose insignia had been torn off in hopes of better treatment. Medics worked alongside frontline riflemen to sort the wounded, a hierarchy of need dictated by combat triage rather than nationality. Frostbite cases overwhelmed aid stations. Evacuations by jeep and half-track ran day and night toward field hospitals in Luxembourg and Belgium. American graves registration teams fanned out under white flags to collect their own dead and, where possible, to mark German bodies for later burial. Bulldozers cleared snow-choked lanes between wrecked vehicles so ambulances could pass. Engineers detonated unspent shells embedded in frozen soil and burned ammunition piles too unstable to move. Each charred Panther or Sherman became both a roadblock and a macabre monument to the ferocity of the fighting. Strategically, the collapse of Wacht am Rhein triggered an immediate German withdrawal to the West Wall. Rundstedt and Model issued fallback orders that prioritized maintaining a continuous front along the Schnee-Eifel and the line of the Roer, but their formations were shadows of the armies that had attacked in December. Fuel and artillery stocks were gone. Divisional staffs reported rifle companies at platoon strength, tank battalions reduced to a handful of running vehicles. The once elite 1st SS Panzer Division reached the Eifel with fewer than 200 effectives and no serviceable armor. Its survivors folded into ad hoc Kampfgruppen under Army command. For the Allies, the operational picture clarified. Eisenhower confirmed that the broad front strategy would resume immediately. with Montgomery's 21st Army Group clearing the Roer dams, while Bradley and Patton prepared to breach the Siegfried Line south of the Moselle. Supply depots in Liège and Verdun shifted priorities from winter clothing and artillery shells to bridging equipment, flamethrower fuel, and gasoline for a spring offensive. The Red Ball Express was rerouted, and newly arrived U.S. 14-ton tank transporters hauled fresh Pershings forward to replace shattered Sherman. The psychological impact of victory reverberated through the Allied ranks. Units that had been mauled in December, such as the 106th Infantry Division, were rotated into quieter sectors to rebuild, while battle-tested formations like the 4th Armored were given only brief respite before being tapped for the next thrust. At division and corps level, after-action reviews emphasized lessons in rapid redeployment, combined arms coordination, and the need for deeper reserves against surprise attack. Patton's insistence on mobile artillery groups and forward fuel dumps was written into Third Army standard operating procedures, and liaison teams were permanently embedded with NIA Tactical Air Command to ensure instant air-ground response. On the civilian side, liberation revealed a humanitarian catastrophe. Bastonia's population, which had survived weeks in cellars, emerged to shattered homes and livestock frozen in barns. Allied civil affairs detachments requisitioned captured German rations and arranged convoys of flour, coal, and medical supplies. Belgian and Luxembourgish authorities scrambled to reopen rail lines, using POW labor under Geneva Convention. Supervision to clear debris. Propaganda leaflets urged villagers not to tamper with unexploded ordnance and promised compensation for requisitioned property, though few believed such promises amid the ruins. War crimes investigations began almost immediately. The massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy dominated headlines, but reports of shootings of Belgian civilians by retreating SS units also surfaced. Judge Advocate General teams collected affidavits, visited execution sites, and compiled lists of suspects. Survivors from Kampfgruppe Piper were interrogated, their testimonies cross-checked against German field logs captured intact during the withdrawal. While the broader war pressed on, the quest for accountability planted seeds that would later bear fruit in the Dachau trials. Politically, the Ardennes failure magnified rifts within the German command structure. Guderian, now chief of the General Staff, clashed with Hitler over the wisdom of retaining the West Wall at the expense of the collapsing Eastern Front. Reserve panzer brigades earmarked for a rumored second strike in the Ardennes were instead diverted to Hungary or East Prussia. Inside the Führer bunker, propaganda minister Goebbels spun the setback as a heroic stand against overwhelming odds, but his speeches rang hollow even to loyal listeners. Rumors of impending defeat filtered through frontline mail censors and civilian grapevines alike. Yet the Allied side was not free of controversy. British and American commanders debated the distribution of credit, with Montgomery claiming his northern pincer had been decisive, and Patton countering that Third Army's pivot and drive had broken the siege of Bastogne. Eisenhower smoothed feathers in public, while quietly expanding Schaaf's Joint Intelligence Center to prevent future surprise attacks. In Washington, analysts revised casualty estimates. Over 89,000 American casualties, and close to 100,000 German, making the Ardennes the costliest single campaign for the United States and Europe. As February closed, the front lines along the Roer and Saar crystallized. Snow still blanketed the high ground, but days lengthened and temperatures crept upward, promising the mud season that tank crews dreaded. Allied reconnaissance flights photographed miles of dragon's teeth, fortifications, and pillboxes ahead. Yet the confidence born of the Ardennes victory remained unshaken. Orders flowed down the chain: rest, refit, and prepare to breach the Rhine. For the men of Patton's elite divisions, memories of Bastogne, Assenois, and Houffalize were already giving way to talk of crossing into the heartland of the Reich. In the devastated villages of the Ardennes, church bells, some rescued from rubble, others newly cast, began to ring again. They told not only for the dead left beneath the snow, but also for the end of German ambitions in the West. The Bulge had snapped back, the front had rolled forward, and the path to victory now led straight through the Siegfried Line. In the weeks and months that followed the Battle of the Bulge, the campaign's legacy solidified into one of the most significant turning points on the Western Front. What began as Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace had instead accelerated the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Ardennes became not only a geographical feature on the map, but a graveyard of strategic illusions, marking the last time the Third Reich would hold the initiative in the West. The 1st SS Panzer Division, once the pride of Hitler's armored elite, emerged from the Ardennes a hallowed relic. Of the thousands of men and vehicles that had surged forward under Piper's command, only a fraction returned to German lines. The division was officially withdrawn for refit, but it would never again operate as the dominant, mobile spearhead it had once been. In its wake, it left a trail of destroyed villages, abandoned armor, and a bloodied reputation tainted further by war crimes. For the Allies, the division's collapse symbolized the unmaking of Nazi Germany's elite force. The American units that had faced them, particularly those of Patton's Third Army, earned a permanent place in the annals of military history. The 4th Armored Division's charge to relieve Bastogne, the 11th's relentless drive through southern Luxembourg, and the 90th Infantry's bitter house-to-house fighting in eastern Belgium all demonstrated the growing maturity, resilience, and tactical sophistication of the U.S. Army in the final year of the war. These units would carry their hard-earned experience eastward into Germany, their reputations burnished by the Ardennes crucible. At the strategic level, the Battle of the Bulge delayed the Allied timetable by only weeks. The planned crossing of the Rhine, initially envisioned for February, was postponed into March, but far from breaking Allied cohesion, the battle strengthened it. Coordination between American, British, and Canadian forces improved. Logistics networks, once strained to the breaking point, adapted with greater flexibility. Intelligence services restructured to avoid future lapses like those that preceded the Ardennes offensive. EDAF, under Eisenhower's leadership, emerged more centralized and responsive. For the German High Command, the failure in the Ardennes irreparably shattered confidence in Hitler's strategic judgment. Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Model, while publicly loyal, privately lamented the waste of elite divisions on a fantasy operation. By mid-February, as Soviet forces reached the Oder River in the east, the futility of continued resistance became clear even to hardened ideologues. Yet the Nazi regime, unable to reconcile reality with its propaganda, clung to the idea of total war. The consequences of the battle extended far beyond military arithmetic. The psychological effect on the German populace was immense. News of the failed offensive, filtered through state media, could not hide the visible signs of defeat. Streaming columns of wounded, destroyed vehicles towed back from the front, and funerals for elite soldiers once thought invincible. In the West, American morale soared. For the families of soldiers who had fought through the blizzard-wrapped forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, the victory carried emotional weight. It was proof that the enemy's best had been tested and found wanting. Historically, the Ardennes campaign exposed the full spectrum of modern war. It demonstrated the deadly consequences of strategic overreach, the value of operational flexibility, and the essential role of logistics in warfare. It showed how terrain, weather, and timing could reshape entire theaters of conflict. And it revealed the importance of morale, how soldiers in foxholes, encircled in towns like Bastogne, or slogging forward through frozen ravines, could alter the fate of armies through sheer resilience. Commemoration began almost immediately. In Bastogne, a monument was raised to the 101st Airborne and their defense. American engineers restored road networks, while Belgian civilians laid flowers along tank tracks and foxholes. Annual commemorations grew into a tradition, with veterans returning to the battlefields where they had once fought and bled. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers would later recount the Ardennes as the ultimate test of American arms in Europe. Yet for many of the soldiers who had lived through the campaign, memory was not always triumphal. The Ardennes had cost the United States over 19,000 killed and tens of thousands more wounded and missing. It had exposed unpreparedness, overconfidence, and intelligence blind spots. But it had also proven the adaptability of the Allied command structure and the indomitable spirit of its soldiers. From privates freezing in foxholes to generals maneuvering entire corps, the Bulge had demanded everything and delivered a hard-fought victory. In the end, the clash between Patton's elite and the 1st SS Panzer Division came to symbolize a broader reality, the transition from a world still vulnerable to fascist aggression to one on the brink of liberation. The snows of the Ardennes melted, revealing not just wreckage and loss, but the direction of history. The road east was open. The Third Reich had expended its final blow and failed. And the soldiers who had met that blow head-on marched forward, not only into Germany, but into the pages of enduring memory.